They laughed at her. Not because she had failed, not because she had stumbled, but because they believed she did not belong. A black woman, standing in a room filled with doubt, dismissed before she had spoken a single word. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that within hours the same woman they ridiculed would rise to become the leader they never expected. Their new boss, the one with the vision and courage to rebuild what was broken. Every neighborhood has its stories of conflict, of division, of ordinary people wrestling with extraordinary challenges. But some stories stand taller than others. They become more than minutes scribbled in an HOA meeting. They become lessons in perseverance, in dignity, in the unshakable belief that even in the face of mockery, change can emerge. This is the story of a woman who carried herself with grace when others tried to strip her of it, who stood rooted in hope when the ground beneath her seemed uncertain. It is a story not only of leadership but of humanity, of how laughter meant to wound can be transformed into applause meant to honor. At its heart, this story is not about a title, a position, or even an election. It is about the resilience of the human spirit, the courage to keep speaking when silence would be easier, and the reminder that true power is not given. It is earned through perseverance, humility, and an unwavering commitment to serve others. This is not just her story. It is an invitation to all of us to look beyond cynicism, to rise above division, to believe in a better tomorrow built not by the loudest voices of ridicule, but by the steady hands of those who refuse to give up. In neighborhoods across this country, stories unfold that remind us of both the challenges and the triumphs that shape our shared lives. Some are quiet victories, whispered in the corners of community meetings. Others roar like thunder, leaving a mark that no one can ignore. This is one of those stories. It began at a homeowners association meeting, a place where people gather to discuss lawns, budgets, rules, and the everyday fabric of community life. But on that particular evening, more profound was stirring. She walked into the room, a black woman, polished yet humble, her presence commanding respect even as she carried herself with grace. She had worked her way up through years of grit and perseverance, overcoming obstacles that many in that very room could not begin to imagine. But to them, she was just another face, another neighbor, another voice at the microphone. And when she stood to speak, some laughed. Not because of what she said, but because of who they thought she was. They judged her before they even knew her name. The sound of that laughter echoed with the weight of dismissiveness, the kind that says you don't belong. You'll never lead us. You're not one of us. But here is the truth about resilience. It is forged in the fire of rejection. She did not flinch. She did not falter. Instead, she spoke with clarity, not only about the broken sidewalks and the neglected common areas, but about vision, about what this neighborhood could become if only people believed in each other. She spoke of children needing safe parks, of seniors needing compassion, of families needing fairness. And though some rolled their eyes, others began to lean in. Because courage has a way of piercing through cynicism. Hope has a way of silencing mockery. Hours later, after debates and ballots, the results were tallied. And the very woman who was mocked, the one they said didn't belong, had been chosen as their new HOA president, their leader, their boss. The laughter stopped. But she did not return scorn for scorn. She returned it with dignity, with kindness, with a steady hand and a stronger heart. For her, leadership was never about proving them wrong. It was about lifting them higher. And from that day on, the neighborhood began to change. Not overnight, but steadily. Because change rarely comes with fanfare. It comes in the persistence of small victories. New flowers planted at the entrance. A transparent budget posted for all to see. A community garden where strangers became friends. And most of all, a culture where voices that had once been dismissed were now invited to the table. Neighbors who had never spoken began to share coffee. Parents who once felt invisible began to volunteer, and those who had once laughed began to understand. Real leadership doesn't come from the loudest voice in the room, but from the one willing to listen, to serve, and to believe in something greater than themselves. Her story is not just about an HOA. It is about America. Because across this nation, there are countless people who walk into rooms where they are underestimated. Countless men and women who are told they don't belong. Countless dreamers who are laughed at simply for daring to believe in a better tomorrow. But like her, they rise. And when they rise, they remind us all of a deeper truth, that dignity is stronger than doubt, that perseverance is louder than prejudice, and that hope, when carried by ordinary people, can turn neighborhoods, communities, even nations into places of belonging. So tonight, let us take her story with us. Let us remember that the next time we see someone laughed at, dismissed, or overlooked, we may be looking at the very leader who will change everything. And let us remember this unity begins with us. It begins in how we treat our neighbors, in how we carry ourselves at the smallest of meetings, in how we choose every single day to either build walls of division or bridges of understanding. Because the world is watching, our children are watching, and history will not remember the laughter, but the legacy, like so many others forged in silence, sacrifice, and strength, tells us that no matter where we begin, no matter how many doubt us, the future bends toward those who persevere. They laughed at her. But hours later, she became their leader. And that is the promise of this country, that we rise, not by tearing others down, but by lifting each other up. The evening air carried with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the murmurs of neighbors converging at the clubhouse. The homeowners' association meeting was no different from those that had come before it. An assembly of familiar faces, a mixture of those eager to have their voices heard and others attending out of obligation. The chairs were arranged in neat rows, the podium waiting in its quiet authority, and the usual tension lingered in the air, the kind that accompanied discussions about budgets, bylaws, and community disagreements. Into that room she walked. Her steps were steady, her posture poised, and her expression calm, though her heart carried the weight of countless battles fought before. She had prepared herself for this moment, not with arrogance, but with a sense of duty. She believed deeply in the power of community, in the potential of neighbors united by shared spaces and shared dreams. But as her eyes scanned the room, she saw the stares, not curious, not welcoming, but skeptical. Some eyebrows raised, others narrowed, and a few lips curled into barely concealed smirks. She was not unknown to them. She lived among them, paid the same dues, walked the same sidewalks. Yet in their minds, she was still an outsider, someone they had not considered as part of the leadership, someone who, in their unspoken judgment, did not fit the mold. The mold had always been familiar: men who spoke with authority, women who repeated what had been said before, leaders who maintained rather than challenged. She was none of those things. The laughter did not begin loudly. It began as a whisper, a chuckle exchanged between two neighbors who leaned toward each other, as though sharing a private joke. Then another smirk appeared across the room, followed by a shake of the head, as if to dismiss her presence entirely. The sound traveled, faint but sharp, echoing louder in her ears than it truly was. It was not the laughter of humor, but of dismissal, of doubt dressed in derision. They laughed because they could not imagine her standing at that podium, directing discussions, guiding decisions, or holding authority. They laughed because of the color of her skin, because of the quiet strength in her voice, because of the unspoken prejudice that still lived in their hearts. And as the sound spread, it was as though the walls themselves leaned in to witness the moment. But she did not falter. Years of experience had taught her that laughter can be a weapon, sharper than words and heavier than silence. She had heard it before. In classrooms where her ideas were brushed aside, in boardrooms where her intelligence was underestimated, in spaces where her very presence was deemed a disruption to the expected order. Each time, she had chosen not to retreat but to rise, not to silence herself but to speak louder with dignity. Her mind returned briefly to those who had doubted her long before this night. She remembered teachers who had told her to lower her expectations, bosses who had overlooked her for promotions, strangers who had assumed she did not belong in the spaces she entered. And she remembered, with equal clarity, the victories she had carved out of those dismissals, degrees earned against the odds, opportunities seized despite resistance, and a career that had carried her to the title of CEO, a role not given, but earned through perseverance and vision. As she took her seat in the crowded room, the laughter lingered in the air, but her spirit remained unshaken. She adjusted her papers, her fingers brushing across the notes she had carefully prepared. Every word she had written carried intention, not just to challenge, but to inspire, not just to confront, but to build. She had not come to argue about rules alone. She had come to show a path forward, a path that many had stopped believing existed. Around her, conversations continued. Some neighbors avoided her gaze entirely, as though her presence was an inconvenience. Others studied her with quiet curiosity, trying to decide whether she would be worth listening to. A handful watched with suspicion, their arms crossed, their minds already made up against her. Yet there were also those, just a few, who seemed intrigued, who had grown wary of the same old arguments, the same old leaders, and who wondered, perhaps silently, whether she might be different. The entrance of doubt had already set the stage. She was walking into a room where expectations were low, where prejudice was high, and where her very identity was treated as a question mark. But she carried herself as she always had done, with dignity, composure, and the unshakable belief that no amount of doubt could rewrite the truth of who she was and what she was capable of. The sound of laughter can be gentle, even joyous, when shared in moments of unity. But on that evening, in that clubhouse filled with neighbors, it carried an altogether different weight. It was not the laughter of connection or community. It was the laughter of dismissal, the laughter that strips dignity from its target and reinforces invisible lines of separation. As she stood at the edge of the room, the chuckles gained momentum. They rolled through the rows of chairs, soft enough to disguise themselves as harmless, but sharp enough to cut deep. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads, and a few leaned back with smug satisfaction. To them, this moment was not about the words she might offer or the vision she might share, about reinforcing what they believed to be true, that she did not belong in the position she sought to occupy. She could feel the sting of it. Mockery is never subtle to the one it targets. It presses against the heart, reminding you of every room you were told was not yours, every table where your seat was questioned, every time someone's amusement came at the cost of your dignity. It draws on the well of lived experience, on old wounds that never fully close. In those few seconds, though she remained composed, she carried the weight of all those echoes. Yet mockery also reveals something about those who wield it. It reveals their fear of change, fear of difference, fear that someone they underestimated might hold the strength to prove them wrong. It is a shield for the insecure, a weapon of the complacent. They laughed not because her presence was laughable, but because they did not know how else to contain the possibility of her power. For her, the sound awakened memory after memory. She remembered being a child in classrooms where her hand was raised but rarely acknowledged. She remembered being the intern whose ideas were laughed off only to be repackaged and praised when spoken by someone else. She remembered the times she walked into meetings where she was the only black woman at the table, and the glances she received suggested she was there by mistake. The mockery of that evening was simply another chapter in a book she had been writing her whole life. But unlike those moments in her past, this time she carried with her the confidence of experience. She was no longer the young student unsure if her voice mattered, nor the overlooked employee struggling to find recognition. She was a CEO. She had steered teams through financial storms, mediated conflicts between people who thought resolution was impossible, and made decisions that shaped the futures of businesses and families alike. The laughter may have been familiar, but so was her resilience. Her calmness unsettled them. They expected her to flinch, to shrink under their smirks, to stumble over her preparation. But she did not. She held her papers with steady hands, her breathing even, her gaze unbroken. If they sought to diminish her, their efforts fell short. If they sought to silence her, they only amplified the power of her composure. Still, the weight was real. No leader, no matter how strong, is immune to the sting of mockery. It lingers in the room, shaping the air, influencing those who have not yet chosen a side. It plants seeds of doubt, not only in the one targeted, but in the minds of onlookers who may wonder whether the laughter carries truth. And so, as she prepared herself to speak, she carried not only her own dignity, but also the responsibility to rise above the sound that sought to define her. There were some in the crowd who did not join in. They watched quietly, perhaps uncomfortable, perhaps curious, perhaps ashamed of the behavior unfolding before them. They, too, felt the weight of the mockery, though from a different angle. They knew instinctively that this was more than harmless laughter. It was exclusion, it was prejudice, it was a barrier disguised as humor. And, while they remained silent, their silence carried its own kind of tension, a recognition that what was happening was neither fair nor right. The moment stretched on longer than it truly was, because the mockery has a way of slowing time. Seconds can feel like minutes when you are the one being diminished. But as the sound faded into murmurs and side conversations, she remained standing in the center of it all, calm and unbroken, carrying the weight, but not letting it define her. Resilience is not born in comfort. It is shaped in the heat of trial, tempered in the furnace of rejection, and strengthened each time life whispers the word, no. For her, resilience had been both a companion and a weapon, carved into her very spirit through years of struggle. What others saw as confidence when she entered that room was, in truth, the quiet armor she had been forced to build across a lifetime of proving herself. Long before the night of the meeting, she had been walking a path lined with obstacles. In her earliest years, she had watched her parents stretch every dollar, working hours that seemed endless, yet still finding the strength to remind her of her worth. They told her she would need to work twice as hard for half the recognition, and though she once believed those words were an exaggeration, she came to understand their truth in the harshest of ways. She remembered vividly the first job interview, where she arrived prepared, qualified, and eager. She had the education, the credentials, and the ideas to offer. Yet when she walked into the room, the interviewers exchanged glances, and she knew before the questions began that their decision had already been made. When the rejection letter came days later, it was no surprise, but it was still a wound. She carried that moment with her, not as defeat, but as fuel. Later, as she climbed the professional ladder, the tests grew sharper. She sat in meetings where her suggestions were met with silence, only to be echoed by others minutes later and applauded as if new. She stayed late, worked harder, outperformed those around her, and still found her efforts dismissed. In those moments, the fire of resilience grew hotter. Each dismissal was not a door closing, but a lesson to stand taller, to refine her voice, to never let another person's doubt dictate her destiny. She remembered the first time she was put in charge of a failing division. The expectations were low. Whispers circled that she was set up to fail, and some colleagues even bet quietly on how quickly she would stumble. But she did not stumble. She listened, she strategized, she rallied her team not with fear but with belief. Within months, numbers shifted, morale rose, and the very skeptics who had doubted her were forced to confront the undeniable truth. She was capable, more than capable, and she was here to stay. Resilience is not about being untouched by struggle. It is about being touched by it deeply, scarred even, yet refusing to let those scars dictate the outcome. She had cried behind closed doors, questioned herself in the silence of long nights, and wondered if the fight was worth it. But each time, she rose again. Not with bitterness, but with renewed determination. Not with vengeance, but with vision. When she stood in that HOA meeting, carrying herself with calm poise despite the smirks and laughter, what the neighbors did not see was the years of fire she had already walked through. They saw only the surface, a woman they thought could be dismissed. What they could not see was the strength beneath, strength born from every rejection letter, every overlooked idea, every door slammed in her face. Each one had been fuel. Each one had built the steel within her. She had learned to breathe through discomfort, to hear mockery and still find her words, to sit in rooms where she was unwanted and still contribute value. That night was no different. When the laughter came, it stung, but it did not break her. When the glances dismissed her, they reminded her of what she had always known, that greatness is rarely welcomed with open arms. Resilience had taught her something else too, that leadership was not about avoiding struggle, but about enduring it with dignity. She had seen others falter when faced with criticism, responding with anger or retreat. But she had chosen another path, to hold steady, to let her actions speak louder than words, to allow time to prove what mockery could not erase. Her resilience was not loud. It did not demand attention. It was quiet, steady, and unshakable, like the roots of a tree weathering storms season after season. And as she sat in that room, surrounded by those who doubted her, she knew that the fire she had endured had not been wasted. It had shaped her for exactly this moment. In most neighborhoods, the homeowners association is known less for its unity and more for its rules. Meetings often circle endlessly around the same topics: the height of fences, the color of shutters, the placement of trash cans. Arguments erupt over lawns left uncut, cars parked a few inches too far onto the curb, or dues left unpaid. For many, the HOA had become a symbol of control rather than community, a body that managed order but rarely inspired belonging. That evening was no different, at least at first. The agenda was filled with the usual complaints. Spreading into common spaces, a neighbor's shed painted the wrong shade of brown, disputes over late fees. People spoke with irritation in their voices, each trying to win ground on their individual frustrations. The room carried the air of division. Neighbors speaking past each other, eyes rolling at opposing views, voices rising not to build but to challenge. She listened. She listened to each complaint, each objection, each wary repetition of the same problems that had been raised month after month. She noticed how few faces carried hope. Most carried only frustration, a sense of inevitability, as if this was all the community could ever be. A collection of squabbles strung together by geography. And then, when it was her turn, she rose. She did not begin by addressing the rules. She did not start with the weeds, the paint, or the fines. She began with a question not spoken aloud, but woven into the very way she carried herself. What if this place could be more than this? Her words painted a picture. She spoke of children riding their bikes down safe, lit streets, where parents did not worry about broken sidewalks or dark corners. She spoke of seniors who had given decades of their lives to work and service, now able to walk to a community bench shaded by trees, greeted not with isolation but with companionship. She spoke of families gathering in shared spaces that were cared for and celebrated, places that felt like home not just in name but in spirit. She did not frame her vision as a set of regulations. She framed it as a possibility that the neighborhood could be more than a list of violations and penalties. It could be a living, breathing community where people cared for one another, not because they were required to, but because they chose to. Some in the room shifted in their seats. They had not expected this. They had come prepared for arguments about budgets and bylaws, not for someone to challenge the very purpose of their gathering. Yet as she spoke, the cynicism in the room began to falter. She reminded them that the purpose of rules was not to control but to guide, not to divide but to protect the shared good. She reminded them that behind every rule was a deeper question. What kind of place do we want to live in? Too often, they had answered that question with complaints and punishments. She urged them to answer it instead with imagination, responsibility, and pride. Her voice did not rise with anger. It carried steady conviction, the kind that comes not from dominance but from belief. She spoke not only of what was broken but of what could be built. She acknowledged the frustrations but lifted them into a larger context, showing that each small issue was part of something bigger, the story of a neighborhood that had forgotten its potential. The vision she offered was not distant or unrealistic. It was grounded in the ordinary. A playground with repaired swings, a clean entrance sign that welcomed visitors, a community garden where neighbors could grow vegetables side by side. Ordinary changes, but extraordinary in their impact. For in those simple acts, people would begin to see each other not as adversaries in disputes, but as partners in creating something worthwhile. Her words struck differently than the arguments that usually filled the air. Where others demanded compliance, she invited commitment. Where others drew lines of separation, she drew circles of inclusion. Where others spoke only of rules, she spoke of possibility. And at that moment, the room began to shift, not fully, not all at once, but enough that some eyes softened, some shoulders relaxed, and some hearts opened just a little wider. When words rise in a room, there are always two kinds of listeners. Some hear only to respond, their minds busy sharpening counter-arguments before the speaker has even finished. Others hear to dismiss, letting the sound wash over them without care, convinced their own view is the only one that matters. But then there are those rare few who listen differently, not with impatience or prejudice, but with openness, curiosity, and the courage to be moved. On that evening, as she spoke of a neighborhood that could be more than rules and fines, the first two kinds of listeners were easy to find. Arms crossed, lips pressed tight, eyes darting with disapproval. Their body language shouted louder than their voices. They heard her but had already decided she was not worth hearing. Yet scattered among them were others, fewer in number but powerful in their quietness. They leaned forward slightly, not in challenge but in interest. Their eyes followed her, their brows softened, their hands rested still in their laps. These were the listening hearts. People wary of division, tired of the same circular arguments, and secretly hoping for someone to speak a language beyond complaint. She felt their presence even as she faced the resistance. For every smirk, there was a nod. For every shake of the head, there was a pair of eyes holding her gaze with respect. And though the laughter from earlier still lingered in the air, it was met with something else now. An undercurrent of attention, a willingness to give her words a chance. Listening hearts are not always loud, but they are powerful. They are the ones who carry conversations home, who replay the words in their minds long after the meeting has ended. They are the ones who, when doubt begins to creep in, remind themselves and others that maybe change is possible. Maybe hope is not naïve. Maybe this voice deserves to be heard. In that moment, she spoke not only to the doubters, but to the listeners. She let her words stretch beyond rules and touch the human spirit. She reminded them that a neighborhood was not only fences and bylaws, but children laughing in parks, families gathering at dusk, elders finding dignity in shared spaces. She gave them not just answers, but a vision to hold on to. And they, in turn, gave her what every leader needs in the beginning: belief, however small, however tentative. The room did not transform instantly. The doubters did not suddenly embrace her ideas, nor did the laughter vanish entirely. But the listening hearts created a shift. Their quiet attention became a counterbalance to cynicism. Where dismissal had once dominated the air, now curiosity began to carve out space. One neighbor, who had walked into the meeting planning only to complain about a cracked sidewalk, found herself reconsidering the bigger picture. Another, who rarely spoke and often felt unheard, began to imagine a place where voices like his might finally matter. And a third, older and set in his ways, caught himself nodding at her words, before quickly folding his arms again, as if to hide his agreement. Listening hearts are rarely the loudest in the beginning, but they often become the strongest in the end. They are the seedbeds where change takes root, the silent witnesses who later become advocates, the ones who help transform vision into reality. That evening, she did not need to win over everyone. She needed only to reach those who were willing to listen with more than their ears. As her words continued to flow, the balance of the room felt different. It was no longer her against a sea of skepticism. It was her voice meeting other hearts, building bridges through imagination and belief. It was a reminder that even in the most divided of spaces, change begins not with unanimous agreement, but with a few who dare to listen deeply. Every meeting has a turning point, a moment when words give way to action, when voices fall silent and choices must be made. On that evening, after the laughter, after the vision, after the quiet nods of listening hearts, the time came to decide. The atmosphere in the clubhouse shifted from restless chatter to focused anticipation. Ballots were prepared, pens distributed, and the weight of decision began to settle across the room. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. Some leaned back in their chairs with certainty, already convinced of where their votes would land. Others hesitated, their fingers tapping against the paper, their eyes drifting toward her, and then away again, caught between doubt and possibility. A few whispered to their neighbors, seeking reassurance that their choice would not stand alone. She sat quietly as the ballots were handed out. There was no campaign speech now, no opportunity to persuade further. Everything that needed to be said had been spoken. All that remained was the test of whether her words had truly reached the hearts of those who listened. She knew well that leadership was never granted easily, especially in spaces resistant to change. But she also knew that every great shift begins with a single choice: the courage of people to decide differently than they had before. The scratching of pens against paper filled the room. It was an ordinary sound, yet it carried extraordinary weight. For some, it was the continuation of the familiar, the safe, the predictable. For others, it was the first step toward something uncertain, but necessary. Each mark on each ballot represented not just a preference, but a belief about what this neighborhood could be. When the ballots were collected, the tension deepened. The board members began to count, their voices steady but the room around them restless. People leaned forward in their seats, watching every movement, listening to every number. She remained calm, her hands folded neatly, her face composed. Though her mind replayed the years of preparation that had brought her to this moment, she had faced countless decisions in her life, both her own and those of others, but this one was different. This was not about a company's future or a financial strategy. This was about belonging, about whether a community would open its arms or close its doors. The counting continued, each number adding weight to the silence. Some votes fell as expected, confirming the skepticism she had felt upon entering the room. But then, unexpectedly, others shifted. A hand that once dismissed her had now marked her name. A neighbor who had been silent for years had cast a vote for her vision. A family that had rarely attended meetings had chosen her as their representative. Whispers rippled through the crowd as the tally grew closer than anyone had predicted. What was once assumed to be an easy dismissal had turned into a genuine contest. Eyes that had laughed now watched with unease. The certainty of the old order trembled in the balance. At last, the final count was announced. The numbers were read aloud, steady and deliberate, and with them came the revelation she had won. By a margin small enough to show the struggle, yet clear enough to leave no doubt, the decision had been made. The room, echoed with laughter, now fell into a stunned silence. For a moment, no one moved. Some looked down at their papers, unwilling to meet her gaze. Others glanced around, searching for confirmation of what they had just heard. A few smiled, quietly satisfied, knowing they had been part of something meaningful. And she, seated at the edge of the room, received the announcement with grace. There was no fist raised in triumph, no expression of revenge. There was only dignity. A quiet acknowledgement that history had shifted, that mockery had been met with resilience, and that belief, however fragile, had found its way into the hands of decision-makers. The weight of the decision did not rest only on her shoulders. It rested on the entire community, for they had chosen not just a leader, but a path forward. Their choice had revealed something profound, that even in the face of doubt, people are capable of change. True leadership is revealed not in victory, but in the response to victory. When the final tally was read and the decision announced, all eyes turned toward her. Some watched with disbelief, others with quiet admiration, a few with resentment that simmered just beneath the surface. The room, once filled with mocking laughter, now stood in the weight of silence, waiting to see how she would respond. She did not rise with gloating or pride. She did not remind them of their laughter, nor did she allow bitterness to taint her expression. Instead, she stood slowly, her hands folded calmly, her gaze steady, and her words chosen with care. For her, this moment was not about personal triumph, it was about service. She understood that to lead was not to win over an enemy, but to extend a hand even to those who had doubted her. Her voice carried a measured calm as she thanked the community for their trust. She did not speak of those who had dismissed her, nor did she seek to shame those who had opposed her. Instead, she spoke of the shared responsibility they now carried together. The focus was not on her, but on them. The families, the children, the neighbors who would benefit from what they chose to build. In doing so, she elevated the room from division into possibility. Some who had prepared themselves for confrontation found themselves disarmed by her grace. They expected retaliation, but what they received was dignity. They anticipated prideful boasts, but they were met with humility. And in that contrast, something shifted. Even those unwilling to admit it out loud felt the quiet strength of her example. Leadership with dignity does not erase conflict. It does not demand instant unity. What it does is create space for healing, a foundation upon which trust can slowly be built. That evening, her demeanor sent a message far stronger than any speech could deliver, that she was not there to prove others wrong, but to lead them towards something right. She knew the challenges ahead would be immense, The laughter that once filled the room would not vanish overnight. There would still be resistance, still be critics, still be moments when her every action was scrutinized with suspicion. But she also knew that the tone she set in that first moment would echo far beyond the walls of the clubhouse. If she chose dignity now, it would guide her through every storm that followed. Her life had already taught her the power of restraint. In boardrooms and offices, she had faced condescension with composure, deflection with persistence, prejudice with unshakable resolve. Those experiences had shaped in her a belief that dignity was not weakness, but strength. A strength capable of dissolving hostility and commanding respect without force. That same belief carried her now, as she stood before neighbors who had underestimated her only hours earlier. Leadership with dignity also means seeing beyond oneself. She did not use her victory to center her own story, but to elevate the needs of others. She reminded the community of the seniors who longed for companionship, of the children who needed safe spaces to play, of the families who hoped for a neighborhood that reflected care rather than conflict. In doing so, she reminded them that leadership was not about titles or power, but about responsibility and service. The impact of her response was subtle but undeniable. Some in the room felt their resistance weaken, not because they suddenly agreed with her, but because they could no longer deny her character. Others, who had been undecided, found themselves moved by the authenticity of her words. Even those who remained steadfast in opposition recognized, if only inwardly, that this was not a leader who would be shaken by petty disputes or swayed by personal pride. What stood before them was a leader who had endured the sting of mockery, the weight of skepticism, and the fire of doubt, and who had chosen not to repay them in kind but to lead with dignity that demanded respect without ever asking for it. Change rarely announces itself with fanfare. It begins quietly, often in small gestures that at first seem almost invisible. After her election, the neighborhood remained cautious, but beneath the surface, subtle shifts began to take root. The laughter that once filled the clubhouse with derision was replaced by quieter conversations in the weeks that followed. People who had never before attended meetings started to appear. Long, silent residents lifted their voices, sensing that their concerns might finally matter. She did not rush to transform everything at once. Instead, she moved with intention, understanding that true change grows strongest when it takes root in the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Her first actions were not sweeping reforms, but simple corrections. Neglected lawns were cared for, broken lights replaced, unused spaces cleaned and repurposed. These small steps signaled something profound, that leadership was paying attention, that the community's needs were no longer being overlooked. Residents began to notice. A single mother walking home at dusk saw a new street lamp casting light where darkness once lingered. Elderly neighbors found themselves greeted with warmth instead of being brushed aside. Children ran through freshly trimmed grass without fear of broken glass or uneven ground. These were not grand gestures, but they were tangible, and they mattered. With each improvement, the spirit of the community shifted. Where apathy had once taken root, there now grew cautious hope. People who had long assumed nothing would change began to test their own involvement. A retired veteran offered to help maintain common areas. A group of teenagers volunteered to paint the faded walls of the clubhouse. Families who had once kept to themselves began attending gatherings, longer fearing that their voices would be ignored. Change in motion is never without resistance. Some still doubted her, waiting for her leadership to falter, holding on to old suspicions. They pointed to the slow pace of progress, questioning whether cosmetic changes could lead to anything lasting. Yet, as weeks turned into months, it became increasingly difficult to deny what was happening. The laughter of ridicule had quieted. The energy of the neighborhood was transforming from division into participation. Her style of leadership encouraged this momentum. She did not dictate from a distance. She walked the sidewalks, listened to concerns at kitchen tables, and showed up where she was least expected. Neighbors saw her not just as an authority figure, but as someone willing to get her hands dirty alongside them. That visibility, that shared presence, reinforced the idea that this was not change imposed from above, but change built together. Momentum grew. Meetings once half empty now filled with spirited conversation. What had once been dominated by a handful of voices was now shared by many, the quiet majority. Those who had stayed on the sidelines for years began to step forward, sensing that this was their moment to be part of something greater. Change in motion is not only about what is seen, but about what is felt. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to everyone. The invisible barriers that had divided people, differences in background, assumptions about worth, fears of being ignored, began to soften. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years, but rarely spoken, now exchanged greetings and offered help. Unity, fragile but growing, became the new rhythm of the community. Her vision had been mocked at the beginning, but now, pieces of it were visible. Not yet complete, not yet perfect, but undeniably present. Where there had been laughter at her expense, there was now recognition, even from those who had resisted most. For in the face of visible change, even skepticism struggled to hold its ground. The motion of change does not come from one person alone. It comes from many people, ordinary in their own ways, stepping into extraordinary responsibility. What she sparked with dignity was now being carried forward by others. Neighbors painting, children planting, families organizing. A once stagnant community was learning again to move. The most remarkable transformations are often not led by the powerful, but by those who never imagined themselves as leaders at all. In the neighborhood, change gained its momentum not from sweeping policies or bold declarations, but from the quiet determination of ordinary residents who discovered within themselves the ability to shape their surroundings. It began with a retired teacher who had once sat silently at the back of every meeting. She had endured the noise of division for years, convinced her words would never carry weight. Yet under new leadership, her voice found space. She spoke gently, offering suggestions for children's programs, and her ideas were not dismissed. Within weeks, she organized a small reading circle for neighborhood kids, and what started as a handful of children gathered in a living room soon grew into a cherished weekly event. Who had never spoken before now bonded over the shared sight of their children reading aloud. There was also the single father who, after years of exhaustion and working double shifts, had given up on engaging with community projects. Felt invisible, certain that his circumstances placed him on the margins. Yet when he saw the new energy sweeping across the neighborhood, he chose to step forward, offering his skills in carpentry. With his hands, he rebuilt benches in the park and repaired broken fences. Neighbors who once overlooked him now thanked him, and his children watched with pride as their father's work became a visible mark of improvement in the place they called home. A group of teenagers, once dismissed as troublemakers, also found their role in the unfolding change. When invited to contribute, they did not resist. Instead, they seized the opportunity, painting murals that told the story of the community's resilience. What was once a blank, lifeless wall now bloomed with color and pride, a reminder that creativity and purpose could replace conflict and disconnection. The same young people who had once been scolded for loitering were now celebrated for leaving behind a gift of beauty that inspired everyone who walked past. Even the elderly, who had grown weary of years without progress, began to re-engage. One man in his 80s, long retired and slowed by illness, began tending a small community garden. It was modest at first, just a few rows of flowers and herbs, but neighbors stopped to admire his dedication. Soon, others joined him, bringing seeds, tools, and stories to share. That garden grew not just in size but in significance, becoming a symbol of shared care, a living metaphor for the renewal that had begun to take root. Each of these actions, small when viewed in isolation, carried extraordinary weight when combined. Together, they formed a chorus of participation, each note distinct but harmonizing into something larger than any one individual. What once been a fractured community began to pulse with life because its people had discovered that they were not powerless. The greatest victories of leadership often lie in awakening this realization, that the power to transform rests not only with those in official positions, but with every hand willing to contribute, every voice willing to be heard. The residents who had once laughed, doubted, or stayed silent now became agents of progress themselves. They were not extraordinary by reputation or status, but by their willingness to believe in the possibility of change and act upon it. This truth became evident in every corner of the neighborhood. The streets grew cleaner not because a single person demanded it, but because groups of neighbors organized clean-up days. The clubhouse grew warmer not because of funding, but because people brought chairs, painted walls, and donated what they could. Unity emerged not from speeches alone, but from shared effort, ordinary people proving, day after day, that extraordinary impact is born from collective commitment. The laughter of ridicule that had once echoed through the clubhouse was replaced by another kind of sound, the laughter of children playing in safe spaces, the conversations of neighbors collaborating, the quiet satisfaction of people recognizing their own agency. This was not a miracle handed down from above. It was a movement built from within, sustained by the very people who once believed they had no power. Ordinary people, given the space and respect to contribute, had become the architects of transformation. Their impact, though modest in scale, reverberated across the neighborhood with profound force. It was proof that dignity, participation, belief could take root in the most unassuming of places, creating ripples that reached far beyond their immediate surroundings. Belief is often the most powerful resource a community possesses, though it cannot be measured in bank accounts or weighed on scales. It is invisible, yet it drives visible transformation. In the neighborhood, after years of stagnation and division, belief slowly returned. What began as tentative hope blossomed into a collective vision that tomorrow could, indeed, be brighter than today. Belief is not optimism. It is not the absence of hardship or denial of struggle. It is the courage to look at broken fences, dimly lit streets, and fractured relationships and still imagine something better. It is the willingness to invest effort not because change is guaranteed, but because the possibility of change is worth the risk. This belief took hold in ways both quiet and profound, shaping the spirit of the neighborhood. Parents who once avoided meetings began attending them not just out of obligation, but out of conviction that their voices mattered. When they raised concerns about safety, they no longer did so in tones of resignation. Instead, their words carried an undertone of expectation, the belief that their concerns would be met with action. This shift in mindset was not trivial. It marked the transition from passive endurance to active participation. Children, too, reflected this newfound spirit. They saw adults working together, neighbors greeting one another, and small projects unfolding into visible results. To the younger generation, these were not abstract gestures but lessons in what it meant to live in a community that believed in itself. They carried that belief forward in their own ways. By keeping the playground clean, by joining after-school programs, by dreaming bigger dreams because they had seen possibility become reality, also grew among those who had once been the most skeptical. At first, they watched from the sidelines, expecting progress to fade as quickly as it had emerged. Yet, as the weeks stretched into months and the months into seasons, even the doubters could not ignore the momentum. They witnessed how their neighbors' collective effort transformed once neglected spaces into places of pride. They saw the resilience of people who had every reason to give up but chose instead to persevere. Eventually, even the most reluctant hearts softened, embracing the truth that belief was no longer a luxury, but a necessity. Belief reshaped the identity of the neighborhood. Where once people said, "Nothing ever changes here," they now began to say, "Look what we've done together." That simple change in language reflected a shift in spirit. No longer resigned to decline, residents saw themselves as participants in a story of renewal. Belief gave them permission to imagine, and imagination gave them permission to act. The power of belief also extended beyond the visible. It fostered resilience in the face of setbacks. When challenges arose, whether budget shortfalls, disagreements, or the natural wariness of effort, belief held the community together. Instead of collapsing under the weight of obstacles, they reminded one another of how far they had already come. They believed that setbacks were not signs of failure, but stepping stones toward progress. Belief inspired creativity. It allowed people to see solutions where before they had seen only problems. A cracked wall became an opportunity for a mural. An abandoned lot became the site of a garden. A neglected clubhouse became a place of gatherings and celebrations. Belief opened eyes not only to what was broken, but to what could be rebuilt, repurposed, and redeemed. In many ways, belief acted as the invisible mortar that held the bricks of the community together. The work of ordinary people, the leadership that guided them, the projects they accomplished, all of these efforts would have crumbled without the belief that their efforts mattered. It was this shared conviction, this faith in a better future, that gave their progress meaning. As days turned into seasons, the neighborhood's story became an example of what happens when belief is restored. Belief did not erase hardship, but it gave people the strength to meet hardship with determination. Belief did not eliminate differences, but it allowed differences to coexist within a larger vision of unity. Belief did not guarantee perfection, but it ensured progress. Belief in a better future became not just an aspiration, but a lived reality, carried forward in every conversation, every shared project, and every hopeful glance toward what tomorrow might hold. True unity is never born in comfort. It is in the fires of adversity that people discover how deeply they need one another, how much stronger they can be together than apart. The neighborhood had long been fractured, shaped by distrust, fueled by arguments, and paralyzed by the belief that cooperation was impossible. Yet, as hardship came into sharper focus, those very trials became the crucible in which bonds were reforged. Adversity arrived in many forms. Some of it was visible: streets that had fallen into disrepair, disputes over budgets, families struggling to make ends meet. Of it was less visible: feelings of exclusion, unspoken tensions between groups, the weariness of years without progress. Each challenge tested the resolve of the community, and, for a time, those challenges threatened to pull people further apart. But something remarkable began to shift. In facing these trials together, the residents discovered that adversity did not have to be the wedge that divided them. Instead, it could be the spark that reminded them of their shared humanity. When storms damaged roofs, neighbors helped one another with repairs. When disputes flared, mediators stepped forward, not with demands but with patience and the willingness to listen. When someone struggled silently, others noticed and offered support, whether through a warm meal, a ride to work, or simply the reassurance of being seen. Unity was not declared in speeches. It was built in acts of service. It was the single mother who watched her neighbor's children after school so he could work late. It was the elderly woman who baked bread and left loaves on doorsteps, a quiet gesture of solidarity. It was the group of teenagers who, instead of retreating into frustration, organized fundraisers to help repair the playground equipment. These were not grand gestures by the powerful. They were everyday actions by ordinary people who realized that adversity gave them the chance to stand together. In meetings that had once been dominated by conflict, something else began to emerge. The very disagreements that had divided the neighborhood now became opportunities to practice collaboration. People did not suddenly agree on everything, but they began to approach differences with a sense of shared purpose. They asked not only, "What do I want?" but also, "What do we need?" Out of that question grew a new language of compromise, one that placed the collective good above individual pride. Unity forged in adversity carried a different kind of strength than unity born of ease. It was not fragile or conditional. It had been tested, stretched, and tempered by hardship. Residents knew that storms would come again, disagreements would arise again, and setbacks would appear again. But they also knew, and this was the crucial difference, that they could withstand those storms because they had done so before, together. The most powerful moments of unity came not in victories, but in shared struggle. One winter, when heating systems in several homes failed, neighbors rallied with blankets, space heaters, and shared meals in the community hall. That week was bitterly cold, but the warmth of human solidarity radiated stronger than the chill. Those who had once lived side by side as strangers began to see themselves as part of the same story, bound not by convenience but by necessity and compassion. Adversity also taught humility. Leaders who once thought progress depended solely on their authority learned that their greatest strength lay in empowering others. Residents who once believed their contributions were too small discovered that every act mattered. Adversity stripped away illusions of self-sufficiency and revealed the truth that survival, and more than that, depended on one another. This unity did not erase individuality. Each person brought their own perspective, background, and history to the table, What adversity taught them was that difference need not be an obstacle to unity, but a foundation for it. The neighborhood became stronger precisely because it was not uniform. Diverse voices created richer solutions, and diverse experiences deepened empathy. As time passed, unity became more than a response to adversity. It became a habit, a way of life. People began to trust that when hardship arrived, they would not face it alone. That trust changed everything. It gave people the courage to speak up, to contribute, to invest themselves in the community with the knowledge that others would stand beside them. Unity forged in adversity left behind something enduring, a shared sense of identity. The neighborhood was no longer defined by its divisions or its struggles, but by the resilience it had discovered together. That identity was not imposed from above. It was written in the lived experiences of countless acts of solidarity, born from the recognition that adversity could either break them apart or bind them closer together. Every great story of transformation eventually turns outward, becoming more than the tale of one leader or one neighborhood. It becomes an invitation. What began as a moment of struggle, marked by laughter and doubt, had grown into something larger. Proof that change is not only possible but within reach for anyone who dares to believe in it. And yet, the lesson of this journey was not meant to rest solely within the walls of a single community. It was a call that extended to everyone, everywhere.